When people today talk about cannabis, they usually imagine a modern pastime, a chilled evening hobby, or something controversial, depending on where you live. But the truth is that humans have been getting high, relaxed, weird, creative, and occasionally very confused for thousands of years, long before anyone invented rolling papers, bongs, dispensaries, or even the idea of recreational fun. The history of weed is basically the history of humans deciding that plants are interesting and then immediately finding a way to smoke them. If you were drifting off to sleep in some ancient world thousands of years ago, you might have smelled the familiar scent of cannabis drifting from a ritual fire, a healing ceremony, or a group of people who simply discovered that this plant makes the world feel funnier. The story spans deserts, mountains, empires, nomads, trade routes, and some extremely confused Victorian scientists who didn't know what to make of it. So as you settle in and let the sleepy history take over, here is the long, wandering tale of when people first started smoking weed and all the strange, sleepy paths it took along the way. The oldest evidence of people using cannabis goes all the way back to ancient Central Asia, particularly the regions of modern-day Mongolia, Western China, and the steppes around Kazakhstan. These were home to nomadic tribes who lived in a world of horses, wide landscapes, and a level of boredom that must have been intense enough to make anyone start experimenting with anything that grew out of the ground. Archaeologists have found cannabis seeds in ancient burial sites dating back to around 5,000 years ago, suggesting that early humans either valued the plant for spiritual purposes, medicinal uses, or the simple belief that life is hard. Let's try this plant and see what happens. In some of these burials, especially in the Yamnaya and Scythian cultures, the seeds appear to have been deliberately burned, likely releasing smoke in ritual ceremonies. So if you imagine an ancient campfire surrounded by horse-riding nomads, there is a good chance that someone was slowly inhaling cannabis smoke while staring into the flames and having deep thoughts. The Scythians, fierce nomads who roamed the Eurasian steppe, were especially known for their relationship with cannabis. Herodotus, the ancient Greek historian, wrote with great fascination the Scythians would set up tents, heat stones, throw cannabis on them, and then howl with pleasure as the smoke filled the enclosed space. Whether he exaggerated for dramatic effect or not, the archaeological evidence backs up at least part of the story. Excavations of Scythian tombs have turned up containers full of cannabis seeds and tools used for heating and inhaling the smoke. So while most people imagine ancient warriors as stoic and serious, the Scythians were absolutely hotboxing tents thousands of years before the modern world ever thought of it. In fact, you could argue that they invented the world's first portable sauna, except instead of eucalyptus oil, they used weed. Meanwhile, in ancient China, cannabis was used for both medicine and relaxation. Early Chinese medical texts describe the plant as having powerful healing properties, used to treat pain, inflammation, and even psychological conditions. One legendary figure, the mythical emperor Shen Nung, often considered the father of Chinese medicine, said to have tested hundreds of plants, including cannabis, to understand their effects. According to tradition, he discovered that cannabis could relieve certain ailments but also had the side effect of making people feel lightheaded and unable to stand upright, which is ancient Chinese medical language for this stuff gets you high. While there's debate about exactly how much of this is myth versus history, what is clear is that cannabis had a place in early Chinese medicine long before it became a recreational substance. Over in ancient India, cannabis found an entirely different kind of cultural home, one that was spiritual, social, and deeply embedded in daily life. Ancient Indian texts, such as the Atharva Veda, written around 1500 BCE, describe cannabis as one of the 5 sacred plants, believed to bring happiness and freedom from anxiety. The plant became associated with Shiva, one of the most important Hindu deities, who was said to enjoy consuming bhang, a cannabis-infused drink still consumed today, especially during festivals like Holi. Imagine a world thousands of years ago where people were grinding cannabis leaves, mixing them with milk, spices, and nuts, and drinking it during religious celebrations that combined devotion with a little bit of psychedelic relaxation. If someone back then asked, when did people start using weed? The answer in India would have been, always. And would you like a cup? As the centuries passed, cannabis spread westward along trade routes, including the famous Silk Road. Traders, merchants, and travelers carried it across deserts, mountains, and bustling ancient cities, bringing the plant into new cultures that quickly found their own uses for it. In the Middle East, cannabis became especially popular in herbal medicine and spiritual practices. The ancient Assyrians burned it during religious rituals, believing the smoke had the power to connect humans with the divine. Later on, in medieval Islamic societies, cannabis transformed into hashish-concentrated resin that could be smoked or eaten. While alcohol was forbidden in many Islamic legal systems, hashish became a somewhat tolerated alternative. And soon everyone from scholars to poets to everyday workers developed a fondness for it. Some cities gained reputations for their hashish cafés long before the idea of a modern coffee shop even existed. Then there's the famous story, mostly fictional but persistent, of the Hashashin, a group of medieval assassins said to use hashish before carrying out their missions. While the legends are exaggerated and filled with dramatic flair, the connection between hashish and the Middle East's secretive orders helped fuel European imaginations for centuries. European travelers returning from the region in the Middle Ages carried back stories of strange plants, strong smoke, and mysterious rituals, which eventually helped spark curiosity across Europe. But Europe itself took a surprisingly long time to embrace cannabis for recreational use. For centuries, the plant was mostly grown for hempist in ropes, sails, clothing, and other practical materials. Medieval Europeans weren't sitting around smoking cannabis. They were using it to build ships and tie things together. Hemp was so valuable that some regions required farmers to grow it by law. But as for getting high, that didn't really catch on until much later. It wasn't until the 19th century, during the era of global exploration, colonialism, and Victorian curiosity, that Europeans began experimenting more openly with cannabis as a recreational drug. Travelers returning from India and the Middle East brought back stories of bhang, hashish, and powerful herbal mixtures that could produce deep relaxation and hallucinations. Some adventurous Victorians joined hashish clubs, where intellectuals, writers, and artists gathered to taste exotic preparations while discussing philosophy or trying to interpret the weird sensations they were experiencing. The French had an especially romantic fascination with cannabis. A group known as the Club des Hashishins in Paris included members like Victor Hugo, Charles Baudelaire, and Alexandre Dumas, who would gather in a luxurious apartment, eat hashish-laced jam, and then attempt to write poetry while everything quietly fell apart in their minds. Many of them described the experience in dramatic and artistic language, mixing mystery, fear, delight, and a whole lot of confusion. This period marked one of the first times in European history that cannabis became associated with creativity and relaxation rather than just rope-making. By the time cannabis reached the Americas, it carried a mixture of medicinal, recreational, and cultural uses. Indigenous groups in Mexico, for example, used cannabis both for healing and ritual practices. After the Spanish colonization of the region, hemp cultivation spread, though, again mostly for practical purposes, like fiber. But throughout the 19th century, cannabis gradually gained ground as a medicinal ingredient in various tinctures and remedies sold in American pharmacies. People used cannabis extracts for everything from pain relief to sleep issues, much like modern CBD products, except without the modern packaging or knowledge of dosage. It was sold in bottles with vague instructions like take as needed, which meant that many people accidentally discovered the psychoactive effects without fully understanding what they were consuming. It was until the early 20th century that cannabis smoking, specifically smoking the dried flowers in the way we recognize today, became more widespread in the United States. Influenced by cultural traditions from Mexico and the Caribbean, cannabis began to circulate in major cities, especially among jazz musicians, artists, and immigrant communities. Jazz clubs in cities like New Orleans became hotspots for cannabis use, with musicians praising it for its calming effects and its ability to help them play more creatively and fluidly. This era also produced one of the earliest slang terms for cannabis smokers, vipers, based on the hissing sound people made when inhaling through a joint. So if you imagine a smoky jazz club in the 1920s, filled with warm lights, the hum of conversation, and the slow rise of music, chances are there was cannabis drifting through the air as well. Of course, the more cannabis spread, the more governments wanted to regulate or ban it. Misconceptions, xenophobia, and political agendas led to the early criminalization of cannabis in several countries. In the United States, the 1930s saw the beginning of harsh anti-cannabis laws, fueled by sensationalist propaganda films like Reefer Madness, which portrayed cannabis users as dangerously unhinged. These campaigns had little basis in reality, but they succeeded in shaping public opinion for decades. Meanwhile, people around the world continued to use cannabis quietly, whether culturally, medically, or socially. Despite crackdowns and restrictions, cannabis never disappeared. Instead, it developed new identities. By the 1960s, it had become associated with counterculture movements, music festivals, peace protests, and young people questioning authority. The plant transformed from a misunderstood substance to a symbol of rebellion, relaxation, and creativity. And now, in the modern era, cannabis has entered yet another phase: medical legalization, recreational legalization, sophisticated products, scientific studies, and an enormous industry built around something humans discovered before they even invented writing. So when did people start smoking weed? The answer is simple: almost as soon as they found it. Humans have always been drawn to plants that make life feel a little lighter, a little stranger, and a little calmer. Cannabis has followed us from ancient fires in Central Asia to modern dispensaries glowing with LED lights. And through all those thousands of years, one thing hasn't changed. Someone, somewhere, at the end of a long day, has always been sitting quietly, watching the world soften around the edges, and drifting into a gentle, sleepy state with the help of this old, familiar plant.